History buffs of Reddit. What is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in WW2. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw two German soldiers walking nearby. He killed one and captured the other, then captured their commanding officer and an entire German garrison. After killing a couple more, he came under fire from other German soldiers and Jewett kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough fricks, however, and a week later he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with a Dutch family. After getting better he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance of the city of Zwolle. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then through the night ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Zwolle. His tactics were so effective he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town. So by the morning the town was free of Germans and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Edit. Well, that escalated quickly. As for the exact diseases and reasons that people had diarrhea, I can only say that the 19th century was gross and nobody knew proper sanitary practices. I'm glad you guys all enjoy debating Imodium until Imodium is made from opiates. If you want to learn more about opium, diarrhea or the combination of the two, then Google it, because I'm busy and Google has better resources than I. Thanks for upvoting everyone. 1014 AD, after defeating a large Bulgarian army at the Battle of Kleidion, Byzantine Emperor Basil II had 99 of every 100 prisoners blinded, leaving each 100th man with one eye so that he could lead his comrades home. Upon seeing his thousands of blinded soldiers, the Bulgarian emperor reportedly died of a heart attack. Basil II was known thereafter as Basil Bulgarslayer. The May incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the US submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen killed in action. He said, "I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships." In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Joan Pujol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the codename Erebel. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high-value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 sub-agents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these sub-agents existed. They were completely imaginary, but regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high-value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had died. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attacks on D-Day were just a diversion, and the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization, since he wasn't a soldier, and an MBE from King George VI. Not that it can't be found in a textbook, but it is never talked about in the US, unless you take Voynich University courses, the history of modern Greece, basically at war with foreign entities or themselves constantly between 1910-1986. Two different fascist regimes, thwarted communist uprisings, the expulsion of a king, and the return of the king like 3 times, before being kicked off for good. Larger-than-life political figures such as Venizelos and Papandreou. Essentially the fighting around World War I started with the First Balkan War against the Ottomans in 1912, and didn't end until 1922, when they were defeated in Anatolia by Ataturk's army. The end of this fighting led to the League of Nations decreeing that all Muslims in Greece must migrate to Turkey and all Christians in Turkey to Greece. As you can imagine, this started a lot more turmoil in the smaller nation, as it was forced to bring in about 35% of their population's worth of people in refugees that didn't speak their language. That was just the beginning, and I could go on, but who knows if anyone will read this. The story of the Bloody Benders, a family of serial killers in southeast Kansas in the 1870s. They let travelers stay and eat at their home, for a fee, of course, and would kill them during dinner, steal anything of value that the travelers had with them, and bury the bodies in the yard. It makes sense why the Benders aren't included in textbooks, but other famous criminals are often included and even become folk heroes. Jesse James is a prime example. When Philip of Macedon had ravaged many Greek city-states, things were looking bad for Greece. He then turned his attention to Sparta, sending the doomed state a letter that read, "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans sent back a rather to the point reply, "If." Robert Liston 1794-1847, a surgeon. In fact, he was described as the fastest knife in the West End, and could amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. The faster the surgery, the more likely the recovery. Though during this particular amputation he went so quickly, he also removed his patient's testicles. However, he also amputated a man's leg in less than 2.5 minutes, who would later die of gangrene. In his haste, he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who would later die from gangrene, and, apparently, cut through the coattails of a surgical spectator, who was so scared he died of fright, this becoming the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. The Battle of Saragahi, 21 British Sikh soldiers were attacked by 10,000 Afghans. All the Sikhs fought to the death, and brought down a lot of Afghans. It, deservingly, should be considered one of the greatest last stands of all time. More people may know about this now compared to if you had posted this question like 6 months ago. But the story of the Clotilda, the last slave ship to carry slaves from Africa to the US. The importation of slaves into the US had been outlawed by the federal government in 1808, but the international slave trade was still active. In 1859, the captain of the ship bet a rich man that he could import some slaves from Africa. He sailed that year and made it back, smuggled them into port at night, took them up the river, and then transferred them to a steamship and burned the Clotilda. The slaves were split according to the people who fronted the money for the captain to sail, and were enslaved alongside the American-born slaves, and were freed after the Civil War. The captain was tried, but not convicted. The slaves settled on recovered land, and founded a town called Africatown that's still there. It got launched back into the news recently, because there's been a lot of attempts to find the last US slave ship, and people believe that they found it a few months ago. When Ivan III of Russia married Zoe/Sophia Paleologina, niece of Dragasis Paleologus or Constantine XI, her uncle gifted them a library along with many other treasures. This library somehow survived the burning of Moscow in 1493, and continued to be passed down to her son, Vasily III, and then on to her grandson, Ivan IV. During Ivan IV's reign of terror, the second half of his reign, he feared the library was too precious a treasure and worried it would be stolen. So he and a few men took the collection out of Moscow, what was most likely a 1-3-day horse ride, and buried the books, possibly in a vault. To ensure the location of the library would never get out, he had the men killed. Ivan IV died before the location of the library was ever revealed. We have no idea what could have been in this library, or if the contents have even survived, though some historians have speculated that Plato's Hermocrates, the final dialogue pertaining to Atlantis, could have been part of the collection. There's no proof that this is true. Not quite the same thing, but I'm surprised at how little is known about Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca, considering how often it's brought up. The economic impact of his generosity is infamous. He gave away so much gold that its value in the Nile River Valley tanked for over a decade, and he ended up borrowing it back at insane interest rates to stabilize the economy of Northern Africa, which raises the question in my mind. If his economic advisors could understand that borrowing it back would mitigate the inflation he caused, why couldn't they foresee it in the first place? I've asked this question multiple times on all the history subs and I've never gotten an answer. The Lake Pigner disaster. Until 1980, Lake Pigner was a smallish freshwater lake with a maximum depth of about 10-15 feet, located in southern Louisiana. Locals mostly used it for trout fishing, and it also had a canal running 10 miles from the lake southward to the Gulf of Mexico. The main industry of the area was a massive salt mine that stood below the ground, partially underneath the lake itself. Thing is, huge natural salt deposits like this often coincide with oil reserves, so it wasn't out of the ordinary when oil companies came searching. In November of 1980, Texaco had set up a rig in the lake and was doing some exploratory drilling, hoping to make bank. Little did they know that one of their triangulation coordinates was slightly off, and so they had incorrectly guessed the location of the salt mine below their feet. Their drill bit punched into the roof of the salt deposit about 400 feet earlier than expected, and water began to drain slowly into the salt. And what happens when salt meets water? It dissolves. As the water dissolved more and more salt, it made more and more room for water to be sucked down, which in turn dissolved more salt and made more room, setting off a massive chain reaction. The oil rig on the surface keeled to the side and collapsed, its workers barely escaping before the water pressure became too much to swim through. The remnants of the rig were sucked into the bottom of the lake in what had turned from a tiny hole to a whirlpool, the force of the water shearing away soil and making a bigger hole as it went. The salt mine at the time was fully staffed with workers 1,500 feet below the ground, who were going about their daily shifts in the mine without any knowledge of the events taking place above them, until they saw water dripping through the roof of the tunnels. Thanks to well-rehearsed evacuation plans, none of them died before the mine was flooded. But water is just about the worst thing you can see in a salt mine. The whirlpool on the surface, having eaten the rig, began to suck down the entire contents of the lake itself, including 11 barges, various small boats, and yes, the poor trout. The whirlpool grew into a maelstrom, its pressure increasing, and in turn building more pressure by creating a bigger and bigger hole, eroding more and more of the salt mine. As it pulled down the entire lake, the water began to shear away at the shores, creating landslides and tearing trees out by the roots. Many of Jefferson Island's 100-year-old pecan trees were lost to the maelstrom, along with several local homes that sat on the shore of the lake and were ripped out by the foundation. The local botanical gardens was destroyed entirely as the soil underneath it was eroded in the span of only a few hours. Compressed air inside the mine finally exploded out through the mine shafts, quickly followed by a 400-foot geyser erupting from the mine's entrance. Not only did Lake Pigner drain entirely into the mine, dragging 64 acres of destroyed land with it, but the pressure was so great that it also reversed the direction of the Delcambre Canal. The ocean water from the Gulf of Mexico rushed northward through the canal to fill the Pigner Basin, temporarily creating the largest waterfall in Louisiana. The chaos didn't end until the pressure equalized about a week later. When things had finally calmed down, the lake had changed drastically. Its maximum depth was now about 200 feet, as opposed to its previous 10. Its shoreline had expanded, chimneys sticking straight out of the water where houses had once been. 9 out of the 11 barges, claimed by the Maelstrom, floated back to the surface, although to remain somewhere in the ground below. The botanical gardens were gone, and many of the local trees. The salt mine was temporarily shut down, and although it did reopen, it was finally closed permanently in 1986. Texaco had to pay $32 million to the salt company, and a further $13 million to the gardens. Miraculously, the only casualties of the disaster were the trout. The most important difference, however, is that today Lake Pigna is now a saltwater lake with ocean species 10 miles away from the ocean itself, all caused by some bad numbers and a 14-inch drill bit. The Battle of Attu. It was the only battle of World War II fought on US soil. Attu is an island in the Aleutians. The Japanese invaded it intending to, who the hell knows, it was far too remote to serve as a staging for an invasion of the mainland. The American soldiers who were sent there had originally been slated to go to North Africa. They were sent to the Arctic in the spring, with gear meant for fighting in the desert. They lost more men to the element than to the Japanese. I'm a nurse, and a few years ago I had a resident who was in this battle. To his dying day he was reluctant to talk about it. Even 70 years later, what I shared here is all he would tell me. Helen Keller's socialist activism. She was literally a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party and spent most of her adult life fighting for socialist causes, but the only thing most people remember her for is being blind and deaf. Girl was an activist, disabilities notwithstanding. P.S. She's the only socialist to appear on American currency, Alabama State Quarter. I wish more people realized how truly post-apocalyptic life after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was. In Britain, we had large cities made of masonry, aqueducts, running water, labourers and accountants, central heating, financial derivatives, or thriving civilization. After the collapse, we lost all of that. The plumbing and concrete broke down. Nobody knew how to fix it. People built mud huts inside old stadium and amphitheaters, using them as forts. That's some Diamond City crap there. It took centuries for the economy to recover to the point that currency was needed again, rather than bartering. A side point. Back in the day, York and Thebes were in the same country. That still blows my mind. The battle for Gloucester. If anyone told you that tankers from the 12th Armored Division of the United States fought alongside German war-matched soldiers led by an SS Hauptsturmführer as well as French POWs to defend a castle with a famous tennis player of the time, two former prime ministers of France and Charles de Gaulle's sister, against an attacking force of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, you'd have called bullcrap upon bullcrap upon bullcrap. But that is exactly what happened. In a small castle near Ritter in Austria, the high-profile prisoners were segregated in the latter part of the war. In May, a prisoner escaped with a letter to Allied forces, detailing the names and location of the high-value imprisoned French citizens. The first Allied unit he encountered was unable to effect a rescue, but started toward the prison, before retreating back behind Allied lines. During this time, the head of the prison died under mysterious circumstances, and the second in command deserted, along with the host of SS guards. The prisoners, meanwhile, had taken over the prison and commandeered the arms left behind. In the nearby town, war-matched troops, sick of the war and the Nazis, had deserted and formed a resistance unit that protected the citizens from Nazi hardline loyalists and SS retaliation. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl approached a unit of the 12th Armored under a flag of truce and requested aid. Captain John Lee agreed immediately, positioning his tanks in the city square as a show of force. Advised of the tenuous situation in the former prison, Lee set off with a number of tanks, but was unable to cross his small rickety bridge leading to Castle Litter with all his forces. He proceeded with his tank, the Besotten Jenny 2 squads of riflemen, Major Gangl, and a truck with a 10-man war-matched Canon Coca crew. On the way, they encountered a group of SS troops attempting to blockade the road, who they promptly ventilated. Arriving at the castle, the captain and the major were greeted by the unlikely sight of French prisoners working side by side with Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader to shore up the castle defenses. The motley crew was not best pleased with the rescue force. That didn't even quite make up a full platoon, but were happy to see any reinforcement. Lee staged his tank at the castle in trance, and the POWs, were matched, and the 12th Armored Crew deployed around the castle in a defensive perimeter. The crap was on. The next morning a Waffen-SS group numbering over 100 launched their assault. One of the opening salvos destroying the tank that had been the heavy weapon support for the castle-itter defenders. The attack continued in waves, with probing during the night to find weakness in the defenders' lines. Even after being ordered by Captain Lee to seek shelter in the castle, the French POWs stayed on the front, pouring a heavy volume of fire at the attacking SS troops. Morning after pillbox, the following day opened bleakly, with sporadic gunfire continuing throughout the night, as well as repeated grenade blasts and 88mm cannon fire. The defenders were running low on ammo. Somehow, the telephone lines back to the nearby town had not been destroyed, and comms remained intact for the duration of the battle. Lee and Gangler called back for the reinforcement, and they arrived in the afternoon to stomp a mudhole in SS ass. The strangest battle of an insane war came to a close. It was 5 days after the Führer died from self-inflicted high-velocity lead poisoning, and 2 days before the official surrender of Germany. The last American Civil War widow actually died in 2003, and the government is still paying pensions to 2 children of Civil War veterans. The Bish Wars. Oh my god, this is funny and intriguing. You all know about the Soviet gulags, correct? Well, within them there became a society of criminals that organized together as thief-in-laws. In Russian, they became commonly known as the Vors. They were viciously anti-authority. They must refuse all orders and all work and spit in the face of officials. These Mathurfrikers were hardcore. Well, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin allowed prisoners to fight them on the front, in exchange for their freedom. So these guys, who are just anti-authority, we are now fighting on behalf of the Soviet regime. The interesting thing though, is that these men were career criminals. So after the war, once they were free, they continued to commit crimes, and many were sent back to the gulags. Now the Vors that agreed to not fight the Nazis began to call these traitors Sukas or Bishes in English. The Sukas became a sect and were the bottom of the pyramid of the gulags hierarchy. However, these guys were now war-hardened fighting machines. Because they took so much crap from the Vors, they eventually rebelled, and the gulags were torn apart in extremely bloody battles. Literally tens of thousands of prisoners died. It was no joke, and the guards allowed them to get away with it too because it was a means of population control. Thus, the Bish Wars. The beginning of the Great War is not nearly as cut and dry as many history books would lead you to believe. Yes, Germany and Austria-Hungary made many missteps, but Serbia was truly a den of snakes that constantly fomented trouble in the region. In matter of fact, the main reason they, and make no mistake, by they I mean the government itself, was well aware of the Black Hand's intentions, decided to assassinate Ferdinand was because they were afraid he'd be too progressive and remove the need for terrorism and anti-Austrian action altogether. Austria-Hungary was more than justified in their harsh terms towards such an unstable and incessantly mischievous nation. The doom of the Mamluks is to this day one of the grimmest and most interesting stories in history. The Mamluks were a caste of Islamic slave lords, in that they were slaves, owned by the Caliph, but were also lords of vast territories in Egypt and the Levant. They were almost exclusively young boys captured in the Caucasus and Ukraine who were brought to the Ottoman Empire, converted to Islam, and turned into slave soldiers. The Mamluks were very important in the Muslim world. They fulfilled a role similar to the Crusaders. They were elite, wealthy holy warriors, and seen as the defenders of the faith. The Mamluks were at times independent, but were eventually subjugated by the Ottomans. At some point the Ottoman Sultan of Egypt grew tired of the factionalism and pride of the Mamluks. He announced a jihad, and invited the Mamluks to the citadel in Cairo to celebrate, then had his own men on the ramparts with crossbows ready to slaughter them as they entered the citadel. Thousands of the Mamluks were killed instantly, and after this the Sultan sent riders across the empire to hunt down the remaining Mamluks and their families, and destroy or seize their estates. The remaining Mamluks briefly established territory in Abyssinia, and fought against the Ottomans, but were eventually defeated. John Tyler, born in 1790 and 10th President of the United States, has 2 living grandchildren. It's a bit more recent, but I love the story of Gander. After 9/11 all the planes were grounded. Almost 7,000 people, which was about 66% of the local population, were forced to land in this tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland. The whole town worked together to make sure all the passengers would have everything they needed. The local ice rink was filled with frozen food that people donated. You couldn't find a closed door in town for stranded people to take a shower or just talk. Once the grounding of planes was lifted, those passengers pulled their money together and created a scholarship for the people of Gander to use. This is one of the greatest acts of kindness that I can view in history. To this day, Gander is the only place outside the United States where they have a piece of the World Trade Center. Two of my favorite are the Attack of the Dead Men and the Brown/Stigler incident. The Attack of the Dead Men occurred during in 1915 World War I, when the Germans laid siege to the Russians in Osawik Fortress in modern Poland. First the Germans shelled the fort and attacked the Russians held. During the second attack the Germans used heavier artillery guns to destroy the fort. Once again the Russians repulsed the attack. The third time the Germans used a combination of artillery and chlorine gas. As the German infantry advanced they heard screaming and saw Russian soldiers charging them. The Russians were covered in chemical burns, eyes red from the gas, and they were coughing up blood. Once again the Germans pulled back. The Russians evacuated the fort 2 weeks later. The Brown/Stigler incident occurred during World War II. A B-17 Leopold was heavily damaged during a bombing run on Bremen. Several of its crew were killed or injured. 2 engines were out. A section of the tail was blown away, and the radio was disabled. The bomber lost altitude and was saved by the captain, Charlie Brown. The bomb flew over an airfield and was spotted by a German fighter ace, Franz Stigler. Stigler took off, caught up to the bomber, had it in his sights, then realized that the tail gunner was not firing. At this point he noticed how damaged the B-17 was and took the advice of his former co to never shoot a man in a parachute. He decided that the bomber was no longer combat capable and was in distress, like a man in a parachute. So he pulled to the side of the B-17 and signaled for Brown to land at the airfield. When Brown continued to fly, Stigler tried to get him to fly to Sweden. Once again Brown continued on. When Stigler realized that Brown was going to try to return to England, he pulled to the bomber's wing and escorted to the English Channel, where he gave Brown a salute to return to Germany. To make a long story short, after the war Brown found Stigler and the two became close friends until their deaths. A book was written called A Higher Call by Adam Mackes. Sorry for the long post. I would like to give this question extra upvotes to help it make it to the big time. So during the Spanish-American War, right after it broke out, the US Pacific Fleet got wind that the Spanish had their Pacific Fleet were sitting in Manila Bay in the Philippines. So the US fleet sails from Hong Kong to go attack them, and along the way a British fleet saw them headed full steam somewhere, and figured they must be headed for a battle. Well, since there were no training videos or simulations in 1898, the best way to get experience was to either be in a battle or watch one. So they followed along behind the Americans to see what was going to happen. Well, as they continued on, a German fleet saw them as well and made the same decision the Brits did and followed along to watch. It's important to mention here that the US ships were the best of the time. Only the British had similar ships, and these new US ships were the best in the world, though low in number. So on top of the spectacle of a battle, everyone wanted to know how they would perform. So finally the Americans get to Manila Bay and find the Spanish still at anchor in the harbor. So they sail up and blockade it. Morning comes and the Spanish wake up to find the harbor blocked by 6, if the best ships money could buy at the time, and past them an assortment of British and German ships and a couple reserve ships from the US fleet. Well, the Spanish, having no idea what the hell is happening, refused to surrender, and unfortunately for them the American guns were longer range, so they just sat out there and absolutely destroyed them, while Spanish shells splashed in the water hundreds of feet away. They fired 6,000 shells at the Spanish. In the end, virtually the entire Spanish fleet was either at the bottom of the harbor or so damaged it was useless. 75 men were dead and hundreds wounded, and the only major naval force the Spanish had in the Pacific Ocean was done for. The US side had a handful of injuries and only one fatality, which was an old engineer who succumbed to heat stroke during the battle. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can watch together.